You can get your own Planet Peterson t-shirt with multiple designs to choose from by going to my Shopify store. Don't let people mistake you for someone who thinks the earth is flat. Proudly show them you're not an idiot. You can also get your very own Spanky. Check out my artwork too. Thanks, enjoy the video. Do you want to know why I think the Bible sucks?
If you'd like to summarize it.
Sure. The thing we focused on was a book that explicitly endorses slavery and genocide. I think is a sucky book, and we were stuck mostly on the genocide thing the whole time.
Well, I mean, I haven't read a lot of the Old Testament, so I don't know what the arguments are to say that it's not slavery. I remember I read them like over 10 years ago, the arguments, and they were convincing to me at the time.
Yeah, well, the only argument people have is, well, Exodus 21 says you're not allowed to kidnap somebody, and somewhere it also says you have to let them go after a certain amount of time. Those are the rules for, it wasn't chattel slavery, it was voluntary servitude, because you could sell yourself for 7 years to pay off debt or whatever. It was like bond servitude. That's if you're an Israelite. If you're a non-Israelite, you can be a slave for life. In fact, it explicitly says you can bequeath the children of your slaves to your children as property and make them slaves for life. So
I'm not sure that's the right way to interpret it. But in any case, like I said before,
I don't really know.
Sure, but that's what Protestants say. It just literally says that God created the earth in 6 days, so therefore it must be 24-hour days. Like, just because that's the way you interpret it doesn't mean that's the only way to interpret it or the correct way.
What could you can bequeath them as your children as inherited property and make them slaves for life alternatively mean?
Like I said, I'm not going to defend something I haven't really personally read.
Yeah, but you will defend it because I'm pretty certain that you're committed to the idea of saying there can't be any immoral commandments in the Bible.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, well, then you will defend it if you ever look into it.
Which, I mean, I'm not going to look into it right now, for sure, because I would have to look into it in depth. Well, I mean, for example, the New Testament, I don't think you can find anything problematic there.
Problematic, like, with regard to, like, at all? Or, like, with regard to slavery, or what?
The moral teachings of the New Testament. I don't think you can say anything in the New Testament sucks.
The women shut up and let your husbands speak for you. I don't really find that to be particularly nice. So we could just say that.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
That was really all I was going to say. Paul, okay, well, from what I understand, Paul probably didn't write that because he actually says some stuff about women earlier in that. I think that's Timothy. I'm not sure, but he actually says some stuff about them that's actually, I would say, pretty, I don't know, fairly progressive for his time. And then kind of in between, there's this shut up part, and people think that was just added there by somebody else, which is a common thing with the Bible, actually. But anyways.
So, I mean, Peter clearly says that Paul's letters are hard to understand and it's easy to misinterpret them. And he's generally not talking, like, he's not writing a Christian encyclopedia or a Christian dictionary. So when he's saying things, he's talking to specific groups of people and he's using shorthand a lot. So I'm pretty sure that he's describing the priesthood. The fact that women cannot be priests simply because of the nature of the priesthood is one of the requirements.
It says they're not allowed to speak in church.
Yeah, and so that's another shorthand to the concept of sermons and homilies are reserved for the priest, who is part of the priesthood and has to be a male.
I don't find that to be very convincing. I find that just to be kind of convenient. Another thing, like for the New Testament, I mean, if we think that there's stuff in the Old Testament that's pretty nasty, then, people say well, just because for example, Jesus never really speaks out against slavery, but he says slaves, you should be subservient to your masters or whatever. Now, people say, well, that's an argument from silence. Just because he didn't speak out against it doesn't mean that he thought it was good, bad, or whatever. And that's true, but he did say, those of you that keep the least of these commandments on earth, you will be least in heaven, or whatever. And that's in reference to all the 600 whatever commandments, that were given in the Old Testament. And some of those are pretty awful.
I mean, I disagree with your interpretation of that verse when Jesus specifically says, he who denies these laws will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. I don't think he's talking about the 613 or whatever of the Old Testament. I think he's talking about the moral law. Because there are, for example, many people who they try to practice the truth and understand it, but they oftentimes practice licentiousness, which is essentially saying you can do whatever you want. And that's not what he taught. He taught that there's a moral law. Although those people, if they're genuinely just confused and ignorant, it might not be morally culpable for them. So therefore they could potentially still have salvation. But generally speaking, people who say that you can do whatever you want, they really don't care about the truth. And so they're probably not going to be in heaven.
Which laws are the moral laws?
It's not about which. Like, for example, there's a lot of...
But that's your argument. Oh, it's about the moral laws. Which ones are those? Doesn't matter. So we don't even know which ones are the moral laws.
No, that's not true. I'm saying that it's not about like dividing them up to say this one is only moral. Because a lot of the time there was symbolism within the law, so that way they tell about a moral truth, although they themselves are not necessarily morally speaking.
So there are certain commandments, and some of them don't seem as good as others, but that's okay because when he said you must keep the commandments, it was only the moral ones. Which ones are the moral ones? And we're not going to get into that. You're not making your case.
I guess, we're just not on the same page. Which, is sort of to be expected.
No, we're on the same page. You're dodging it.
No.
Yes.
I'm saying there are all of the Old Testament's laws. Some of them are directly moral. Don't unjustly unalive somebody. That's a direct moral thing. Don't steal from other people. Don't bear false witness, etc. Yeah. Some of them are not directly moral. Don't wear mixed fabrics. It's not a moral issue about fabrics. However, it can have...
Is disobeying God's commandments immoral?
Disobeying God's commandments that he set for you is immoral, yeah.
So then they would all be moral commandments.
Well, so
because the act of disobey, it's not just that you've murdered somebody, it's that you've directly disobeyed God's commandment, which is to not do this thing. And if you wear mixed fabrics, you've directly disobeyed God's commandment. Because it's not the action in and of itself, because what I'm told is, in a world without God, nothing would really be moral or immoral. So you could do whatever you want. It's only if God says so.
Well, no, that's a Protestant understanding. And you used to be Protestant, so it makes sense that you have a Protestant understanding.
I didn't. I was Catholic.
Oh, that's right. You were Catholic. Well, still, it doesn't really make sense why you're using a Protestant argument. But that is a Protestant argument. So, we don't say that things are immoral because God declared them immoral. We say they're immoral because it's part of the immutable nature of God. All creation reflects the immutable nature of God. And part of that is order, part of that is beauty, part of that is morality, etc. So unaliving people is wrong because it's against the nature of God being life. He is the author of life. He is life itself. So that's why we have an inherent right to life until, for example, we unjustly don't deserve it. For example, unaliving somebody, then you might deserve justly to have your life taken away. But if we talk about
the Bible says that if a woman has if a woman conceals her virginity before marriage, then she's to be put to death.
So first of all,
according to your God, lying about being a virgin is worthy of death, and that somehow is on par with actual murder.
Okay, so first of all, really briefly, just so I could finish the argument about the mixed fabrics, that's not an inherently moral thing, although when God commanded it to specific people to obey that commandment, then disobeying that commandment was then immoral for those people who he commanded it of. Now, he doesn't command that in the New Testament, because like Hebrews says, there's a new law because there's a new priesthood. That's what Hebrews chapter 7 says. When we, for example, we don't have to wear...
that sounds a hell of a lot like, oh, now all of a sudden, now that God has commanded it, now it is immoral, which you just told me is not the point.
No. I was making a distinction. Some things are inherently immoral. Some things are not inherently immoral, but they become immoral because God commands you don't do it. And if you do it, it's then immoral because you're breaking the commandment. Now, the unaliving one is that way because of the fact that it's that way naturally, and also God commands it. So it's twofold. But with wearing mixed fabrics, if he doesn't command don't wear mixed fabrics, then it's not a moral issue. But it can also be a symbolism for some other moral issue. For example, in intermingling truth with lies. That's a moral issue. And I think that's what it's talking about.
What's talking about?
The mixed fabrics thing. The mixed fabrics thing, although it was a commandment in the Old Covenant, so if you're part of the Old Covenant, you had to obey that directly, it is symbolism for the New Covenant to understand that you cannot mix truthhood with lies. That's the symbolism in that commandment that we still have to obey. For example, don't gaslight.
Sure. So I'm very confused because you say, well, no, we don't believe in divine command theory, but then you go about saying, well, there are times when God declares something suddenly is immoral, which is divine command theory.
No, he doesn't command that it's immoral. He says don't do it. And the commandment is then a moral issue. The fact that he commanded to do or not do something, the obeying or disobeying a commandment is a moral issue, but the thing itself does not have to become moral issue suddenly.
I don't see any meaningful distinction in that. Not really. So
that's understandable for you.
Right. So do you think lying about your virginity is on par with murder? Do you think they're equally bad?
When it comes to the Old Testament, in the context of that time period, there might have been some aspects of how that affected society to such a degree that it might have been a very serious thing. However, the much more important aspect of that is it's talking about, anytime the Old Testament commands the death of somebody, it's saying that in the New Testament, it's saying that in general, within life itself, if you do this thing, it spiritually destroys your soul. It destroys the integrity of your soul.
Lying about your virginity.
Yeah, lying about your virginity destroys the integrity of your soul.
Okay. Does eating shellfish destroy the integrity of your soul?
That's not a moral issue, though. So eating shellfish, I don't think God ever...
Pretty sure the penalty is death.
Show me. Hold on. Let's just assume it's true. It would then be relating to... Is this one of those ones where you can't eat certain animals if they have hooves or whatever?
It's part of the Levitical. These are clean and unclean things, yeah.
Okay. So when it comes down to the clean and unclean things, that's the moral aspect. Clean and unclean isn't about how God just randomly... It seems like he randomly... what is it called? He randomly assigns different things, but there's spiritual significance in each of these things that is... you could sort of figure out the theology of it and understand that clean and unclean things refer to moral aspects of life. I don't know the exact thing about shellfish, but it would just basically be...
I'm not sure if that's part of the... And if you do any of these things, the penalty will be death. I'm thinking that the shellfish one actually isn't in that list. I know the concealing your virginity is, dishonoring your mother and father. I know that is. It's really weird. Why is it that you think I've never understood why penalties like that only exist for women. If a woman does it, kill her. It's not even written about for men. Sounds like just the kind of thing that a bunch of barbaric savages would have made up to justify their barbarisms and their savagery.
I mean, it comes back to, like, if you want to interpret the Old Testament, it's really going to be easy to interpret it in such a way that, for example, God would be unjust in knocking over the Tower of Babel and scattering people's tongues because all they were trying to do is build a tower. Like, why is that so wrong of him? Of those people. So why is God knocking over the tower and scattering them across the earth and making their tongues different? But like, he always leaves that door open so that in any different area, for example, the flood, very easy one, it could make it out like he's a villain for flooding the earth, if you want to interpret it that way, and a lot of people do. But it doesn't mean it's the right way to interpret it, and it doesn't mean it's true, and it doesn't mean it's fully supported by the text if you draw it out to its fullest logical conclusions with every piece of data and all the context around it. Like, I just, if you're going to do that with every aspect of the Old Testament, it's going to take a lot of time to research and study all the context to know what it's talking about. For example, the person who was Elijah, who threatened these kids with a bear or something like that, and that's just also not like a true assertion. If you actually look into the text, they weren't kids, they were young men, and they were threatening his life. And that's what he was doing, was calling on bears to defend himself. Not on bears, but on God, who then sent bears to defend him from the gang of thieves, essentially, and unalivers. So, like, there's always going to be context. I don't know the specifics for the ones that you've brought up, but I've researched enough of these to know that it's not the case.
Would you support a criminal justice system that just has we just have this pit and there's bears in it, and when people say things that can be interpreted as threatening toward other people, we should throw them in there to be mauled by the bears? Is that a world you would like to live in?
I would not like to live in that system, no.
But there's nothing wrong with it?
Is that the thing is that exactly a perfect analogy to what the Bible describes? I disagree with that.
Oh man, I got a question for you. I went to the Getty Art Museum, and the whole Renaissance period, basically, if you're going to produce a work of art, it was either Jesus or the Virgin Mary. Nobody ever painted or sculpted anything other than those two things. It's kind of whatever. But I saw a lot of paintings of the baby Jesus, and in a huge number of those paintings, John the Baptist was always with him. And one of them actually talks about, it says like Jesus with his brother, John the Baptist. And I never had heard of that before. Do you know where this idea that they were brothers comes from? Have you ever heard of this?
They're literally cousins. It says it in the Bible that they're cousins.
Oh, okay.
Or second cousins. Like, Mary was the cousin of Elizabeth, and Elizabeth had John the Baptist, so they're like second cousins.
Where does it say that Elizabeth was John's mom?
John was born from Elizabeth and Zechariah. That's like right there in Luke chapter 1 or 2.
Oh, okay. I don't remember that. From what I remember, it's just John's an adult, and the baptism's like one of the first things that takes place in each of the Gospels or whatever.
No, that's in Mark. In Luke, we have the whole story of Zechariah. It's in Luke chapter 1, in fact. Like, the whole concept that Zechariah was visited by an angel and who said that God heard your prayers, your wife Elizabeth bear you son, you'll call him John, etc. And then he literally was John the Baptist, and he went out into the desert. So it ties it all together. It also says that Elizabeth was the cousin of Mary, I think in the same chapter 1. Yeah, literally, Angel Gabriel says that, your kinswoman Elizabeth in her old age. Now, I don't know if it's cousin or sister, because kinswoman can mean both. Like, basically, it was like the word bro or fam in English. Like, it can mean a close relative, cousin, sister, brother, or a close friend or whatever.
Okay.
But in any case,
I'm
they're
looking at it
basically
right now. Yeah. Have you heard the idea that the character of John the Baptist was deliberately altered in later Gospels to draw down his significance because people were thinking that he was actually maybe not exactly the Messiah, but something like that? Have you ever heard that?
I mean,
because it's interesting how the character of John the Baptist does change in the later Gospels. He becomes less and less. They just downplay him. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely in the realm of conspiracy theories that I just don't buy into. I think there's no strong arguments for them, and I think they're interesting and they're entertaining, and that's as far as they go in terms of having any relation to reality.
Um, okay, but I mean, people get this by reading the text.
Misreading it, yeah, reading it how they want to for their own personal agenda or whatever.
Um, really? I mean, is that really what you think it is?
There's no other way. Like, okay, I don't have any strong proof that the Gospels were altered. I have people suggesting maybe this is a theory that could explain this, but it's not the best theory to explain something. There's other better theories. Like, it is what it is.
So here, I'll just read you the notes that I took on this from a book I wrote that, or a book that I read that talks about this, and just tell me what you think. There are problems that arise with the historical Jesus versus Jesus the Christ. Why was he baptized? To cleanse his sins, as it says in Mark, or to enter John's church, as Josephus says. So that would make Jesus a disciple of John. John's followers refused to follow Jesus because John was superior to him. In order to save face, the Gospels change. In Mark, John is a prophet and mentor to Jesus. John never calls himself the Messiah, but never says Jesus is either. Matthew, who took inspiration from Mark, almost word for word copies the baptism narrative, but inserts the idea of Jesus as the one coming after me, saying Jesus will baptize him in the Holy Spirit. And John the Baptist refuses to baptize Jesus at first, only until Jesus says it's okay. Luke repeats the story, but doesn't actually mention the baptism at all. The baptism is completely left out. And Luke also has a unique birth and origin story for Jesus and John the Baptist. So now we're introducing the story for John the Baptist to be like, well, okay, here's how we explain these like problems that people are having in reading into it. And there's a few more things here. And these are just bullet points. So those weren't full ideas, but there you go. What do you think of that?
I mean, that's just describing a bunch of differences between the Gospels and a bunch of aspects of how they recorded it. But I still, like, I know that the Gospels each of them were letters written to specific people for specific purposes. And each of them had different agendas. For example, Luke was trying to be a natural historian of human history. And so he recorded things as plainly as he could, while also tying in, I think it was Matthew who was specifically trying to refer to the prophecies of the Old Testament because he was writing to Jewish people. And Mark was writing to the Romans, I'm pretty sure. So he was trying to emphasize basically the things that would appeal to people who love to go to the Colosseum. That's why he constantly has a lot of action, miracles, and like the word immediately so many times. But the point is, like, nothing in there so far suggests to me that anything needs to be brought out to explain any of these things in these passages besides what's already there and the already accepted explanations that the Catholic Church gives. For example, the fact that Jesus was baptized not because he was a sinner, but because he identified with sinners, which is the same reason he died on the cross, not because he's a sinner, but because he identifies with us to take away our punishment onto himself. I mean, that's just plain as day to me.
Well, yeah, but it doesn't say that. That's just like, it also doesn't say that Mary ascended body and soul into heaven. But the Catholic Church is like, well, yeah, but that's what happened. Why? Because it has to have happened. Why? Because that's our interpretation of the nature of Mary.
No, you were never a Protestant, so you shouldn't be using sola scriptura as one of your foundational arguments when interpreting the Bible. Like, that's just disingenuous.
So what evidence do we have that Mary ascended to heaven, body and soul?
Because the reason that the church has any of this information, the Gospels, as well as the fact that Mary never sinned, and that she ascended
that's not
to
a
heaven.
fact. That's what people think.
It's a fact. But the reason we have these facts...
But you don't know that.
Yeah, we do.
No, you don't.
Well,
not even remotely close to 1% of her life is documented.
Right, documented in the Gospels. But like I said, we're not sola scriptura. We don't believe the Bible alone is our sole authority on interpreting the events that happened during those times.
I didn't say that. I didn't say that you should. But
You're
what?
implying.
Sorry, what?
You're implying it.
Well, no. What I'm saying is you don't have anything else to go off of except for just making arguments.
Yeah, we do.
Okay, what evidence do we have that Mary ascended to heaven, body and soul?
Because the apostles passed this fact on to the churches, and they preserved it in an unbroken line for 2,000 years. And we have evidence of this preservation in various writings throughout the past 2,000 years, including in the early church fathers.
Such as?
I'm not too familiar with the church fathers on the Assumption.
This is very... How convenient that the evidence not only leaves no trace, but could leave no trace because we're claiming it's word of mouth. Just how convenient that that's how we fall upon this.
It did, because here's the thing: you can't explain the existence of things like Justin Martyr in 151 AD saying that baptism, water baptism, is literally what Jesus is talking about in John chapter 3, unless he received this through a word of mouth teaching from the apostles. Because remember, he's writing in 150 AD, so it's only a few decades after the Gospel of John was written. And like you can try to say, well, he made it up, but there's no evidence to support that he made it up, especially when the same teaching was found throughout other regions at the same time period. So if this teaching spread that quickly in only a few decades around such a vast area in like the Middle East, etc., then it's because the only reasonable explanation is because it was passed on through word of mouth. So the evidence of it being
but that
passed on
doesn't
through
make
word
it
of mouth,
true.
No, but it's evidence that it was passed on through word of mouth, because there's no other way to explain it. There's no other way to explain its existence.
Or somebody made it up centuries or decades later.
That doesn't explain. Okay. There's a book
like the story of the woman caught in adultery. That's in 0 manuscripts until the 1200s.
No, because you don't have the original manuscripts. The earliest manuscripts you have are like the 3rd century. You don't have the first.
Yeah,
and
it's
second
not
century
in any of those.
Right, it's not in the 3rd century manuscripts, but it might have been in the 1st and century ones that are now lost. They might have had it back then. They might have had the 1st and 2nd century manuscripts that contained the story.
Of course, literally anything is possible, but does that actually make sense as an explanation, or does the idea that somebody made it up make better sense? Or like we can say that, well, there was this tradition that people passed that story around, and that's a plausible explanation, and they just decided to add it more than 1,000 years after the event supposedly took place. That's also fine, but none of that gives me any confidence to think that it ever happened.
So your argument for the existence of that added text in John chapter 8 is that a few hundred years later, everybody started adding that section in there just because, and nobody questioned it. The people who stand on the fact that Scripture is all true and historically accurate, those people all said, this is fine. We're just going to ignore the fact that you guys added this, and we're going to add it too. And nobody questioned it. Nobody wrote against it. That's absurd. They only would have done it
because we know that happened. The Johannine comma isn't original, but it was put into Bibles, and then people later said we should probably take this out.
That's the exact same argument I'm making about this. In the 1st and 2nd century manuscripts, which they had and we don't, it might have been present, later taken out as potentially questionable, and then later re-added when they examined the original 1st and 2nd century manuscripts and found that it was there. It's true. It's a reasonable argument for both cases.
I don't know if you were talking about the woman caught in adultery or the Johannine comma when you said that, but the facts are we have early manuscripts from like the 300s and the 400s, the Vulgate, whatever one the Vatican keeps locked up, the Alexandria. I can't remember what the manuscripts are called, but whatever. I'm sure you know about them. None of them contain that story. It can't be found in any partial or complete manuscript until like the 1200s. So obviously we don't have every single manuscript that was ever written, but why would we... So you can argue that it's in some lost manuscript. Sure, literally anything is possible. But is that the inference to the best conclusion? I don't think so.